Some truths are not buried. They are folded away, waiting in silence to be forgotten. This story begins with an umbrella that should not exist, and a man who died on paper but lived in secrets. As Holmes navigates a web of deception that stretches from Admiralty Ink to the rain-slicked streets of Paddington, justice will come dressed not in triumph, but restraint. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let's follow the whisper Holmes refused to say aloud. It was upon a damp and sullen afternoon in early November that I found myself once more in our rooms at Baker Street, the warmth of the fire within providing a fragile counterpoint to the ceaseless drizzle that clung to the windows like a fogged memory. Holmes sat in his customary position, stretched languidly across the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his gaze fixed abstractedly upon the hearth. The rain had dulled even the rattle of hansoms on the cobbles below, and London, that mighty city of 1,000 clamours, had fallen into a silence that was almost conspiratorial. It was in this silence that the bell rang. Our landlady showed in a gentleman of respectable bearing, though plainly ill at ease. He was of middling height, dressed in a grey coat too fine for a mere clerk, and yet too conservative for the social haunts of the West End. His hat was soaked, and as he stood just inside the doorway, a tremor, not of cold, but of deliberation, passed through his shoulders. I do apologise for the intrusion, gentlemen, he began. I was told, that is, I was advised, you might be consulted in matters of, well, difficulty. Holmes inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Pray come closer to the fire, sir, he said. You are expected, though perhaps not by name. Dr. Watson, you may wish to note the cuff of the gentleman's left sleeve. The man, visibly startled, took the offered seat, but said nothing further until Holmes, after a pause, prompted him gently. Your name, sir? Renfield, Alfred Renfield. I am employed, seconded, to the Department of Contracts at the Admiralty. A dry post, one would think, murmured Holmes. And yet your concern is not the sort that springs from mere procurement lists. Renfield offered a strained smile. I had thought myself immune to the fever of imagination, Mr. Holmes, but something occurred 2 nights ago, something peculiar, at Paddington Station. It is, I fear, both trivial and unnerving, and I confess I hesitated before coming. Trivialities, Holmes replied, are the latchkeys of catastrophe. Proceed. Renfield adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, though I noticed they were perfectly aligned. It was raining when I left the office, nothing unusual there. I had carried an umbrella, black, tightly furled, with a silver ring at the handle. I placed it in the rack near the 3rd platform as I awaited my train to Maidenhead. I turned to purchase a newspaper, no more than 3 minutes, I dare say, and when I returned, it was gone. Stolen? I asked, puzzled by the gravity with which he spoke. That is what I believed. But then, and here he paused, swallowing once before continuing. Then I saw that the rack had not been emptied but replenished. 6 umbrellas now stood there, where there had been but 3. Mine was not among them. Holmes's brow furrowed faintly, though his eyes remained half-lidded. I thought to take one in its place, Renfield went on, but each was subtly different, the same general appearance, black, polished shaft, crook handle, but some were worn differently, others slightly damp despite the shelter. I confess I hesitated. I left without one. Holmes opened his eyes fully now and regarded our visitor as though peering at a slide beneath his microscope. Mr. Renfield, are you in the habit of making enemies? Not to my knowledge. Then permit me a rather forward question. Are you in the habit of betraying secrets? Renfield's face paled. I beg your pardon. Holmes stood, crossed to the hearth, and leaned one elbow against the mantel. 6 umbrellas, he said quietly, each of similar appearance left in the same place. a most theatrical arrangement, unless it were intended for a very specific observer. Renfield's eyes flicked to mine, as though searching for leniency. "I know how it sounds," he said at last. "But there was something in it. Something arranged, as you say. I felt watched, perhaps, these past weeks. Nothing overt. A glance too long. A paper mislaid at the office. A sense that the doors close just after I pass." Holmes turned back to him. "And yet, you chose to bring this concern not to your superiors, but to me." "Yes, because I feared that if I am wrong, I have lost only pride. But if I am right—" He left the rest unsaid. There was a pause, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. Holmes folded his arms. "You are not a fool, Mr. Renfield," he said at last, "nor, I think, are you unaccustomed to shadows cast by things left unsaid. But the pattern here is not in umbrellas. It is in their presence, where none ought to be. And that, my dear sir, is no small matter." Holmes gestured to me. "Watson, make a note. 6 umbrellas, identical in kind, but varied in wear. Left, where 3 had stood. The central figure claims no knowledge of the substitution, yet fears he was its intended audience." He turned again to Renfield. "How many minutes elapse between the placement of your own and your return?" 3, perhaps 4. "And the location?" "Just beside the south entrance to platform 3. Holmes nodded slowly, then regarded the man with renewed curiosity. "And you, Mr. Renfield, how long have you held your current post?" 6 months. "Preceded by?" "I was attached to the Naval Registry." Holmes's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained light. "Interesting." He turned abruptly toward his desk and began rifling through a set of railway timetables. I turned toward our visitor, who now sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring at the edge of the carpet. A bead of moisture clung to one side of his collar, though the rest of his coat had dried in the fire's warmth. Holmes spoke without turning. "Mr. Renfield, your umbrella may yet be found. But I suspect what you truly lost was not made of silk and cane." The man gave no reply. I leaned forward. "Mr. Renfield, did you ever discuss Admiralty procedures, routes, schedules, courier patterns with anyone outside the office?" Renfield flinched. "No." Holmes looked over his shoulder. "That is a lie. I swear. No need to protest. Your collar bears a press, not made by rain, but by a gloved hand. Someone confronted you. Recently and forcefully. That same someone ensured your umbrella was lost." Renfield exhaled, long and slow, and for a moment seemed to collapse inward. "What should I do?" Holmes returned to his seat and regarded him with something like pity. "You should allow me to find the question hidden inside the answer you were given." He turned to me again. "Watson, if you are at liberty tomorrow morning, I believe we must pay a visit to Paddington Station. But first, fetch the atlas. I wish to compare several timetables with the westward routes along the Thames. There is something peculiar about the symmetry." And with that, as the rain pressed more softly against the glass, and Mr. Renfield sat silent and unmoving in the firelight, the case of the 6 umbrellas, so trifling in appearance, stepped quietly across the threshold of our lives. I had scarcely finished stirring the milk into our morning tea when my eye happened to fall upon a modest column in the lower right-hand corner of the Evening Standard, nestled between the Society notices and a review of the week's parliamentary debates. The item in question, no more than 10 lines of cramped type, was headed plainly, "Young Admiralty Clerk found dead near Paddington." My instinct, long tempered in the shadow of Holmes's deductive brilliance, paused. The brief report informed me that a junior functionary, one Edward Grigsby, had been discovered at the foot of a brick embankment behind Paddington Station late the previous night. He had apparently suffered a single knife wound to the chest. Nothing had been taken. His purse, watch, and even a half-full packet of cigarettes remained undisturbed. "The constabulary," said the piece, "were at a loss to suggest either motive or suspect, though they did not rule out a regrettable altercation with ruffians." I read the paragraph again, this time aloud. Holmes, who had until that moment appeared engrossed in trimming the ash of his pipe with a silver blade, looked up the instant I spoke the words Paddington Station. He said nothing, but the slow lift of his right brow conveyed a spark of interest. "No theft," I remarked, folding the paper, "and no known enemies. Yet a man is murdered within yards of a major terminus, and the police are reduced to shrugging their shoulders." Holmes nodded absently. "And what, pray, do you make of it?" "I make of it only that something foul occurred beneath the arches last night. It may be sordid, but surely no more than that." He took the paper from me and scanned the column quickly. Then, with that peculiar sharpness that always signalled the first click of his mental gears, he set it aside and crossed to the window. "Watson," he said, "do you recall what time Mr. Renfield claimed to have lost his umbrella?" "Just before 7, by his account." "And the discovery of the body?" "9:30, according to the article." Holmes turned back to me, his expression taut with purpose. "Then the two events occupy the same window of darkness, in a radius of less than 200 yards. You believe they are connected?" "I do not believe," he said. "I observe that the oddity of 6 umbrellas arriving where one disappeared cannot stand, separate from the stabbing of an Admiralty clerk who carried nothing of value and spoke to no one. Coincidence, my dear fellow, is the favourite refuge of the uninspired. I find it no refuge at all." With that, he strode to the bureau, seized a pencil, and scribbled a rapid message. "Mrs. Hudson," he called, "see that this is wired to Inspector Lestrade at once. Tell the boy to wait for a reply." "What have you written?" "That Scotland Yard is to expect us by 11, and that I require immediate access to the file on Mr. Edward Grigsby, deceased." "You presume the Yard will yield it?" "I presume they will be curious enough not to deny me." He was already fastening his cuffs as I gathered my coat. "Where are we bound?" "To Scotland Yard," he said, "and then I suspect to a place where umbrellas speak louder than pistols." The hansom made swift progress through the sodden streets. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey, eyes fixed on some internal geometry known only to him. At one point, he muttered a single line, 6, appearing where 3 had stood, and now one less clerk to count their number, before lapsing again into brooding silence. At the Yard, Lestrade greeted us with a mixture of professional courtesy and wary amusement. "I thought I might be seeing you, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The moment I read that item, I half expected a telegram." "You have the file?" Holmes asked without preamble. Lestrade gestured to a narrow folder, its margin marked by a red stripe. "Only the preliminary notes, I'm afraid. The post-mortem is set for this afternoon. Single stab wound, clean, angled upward. No defensive injuries." "Tell me about the clothing," Holmes said. Lestrade pursed his lips. "Neat. Respectable. Still buttoned. But the constable who found him noted something peculiar. An impression on the overcoat's back. Damp and oddly shaped. Like the garment had been folded beneath him for a time before he fell." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Folded?" "So it seemed. There was even a partial curve, like the shaft of—" "An umbrella," Holmes said. Lestrade blinked. "Yes, now that you mention it, though there wasn't one found with him." "No," Holmes murmured. "It had already gone on to its next appointment." He stood still for a moment, then turned to me. "Watson, when we return, I require your assistance in retrieving the professional history of Mr. Renfield. I believe our civil servant is more deeply entangled in this matter than he has confessed, and time, I fear, is beginning to conspire against us." We left the Yard shortly thereafter, Holmes once again silent, though now with the purposeful energy of a man following not a suspicion, but the scent of certainty. The morning had not improved. If anything, the drizzle had settled into a sullen mist that seemed to leach colour from every stone of Paddington Station, rendering the iron girders and sooty bricks alike in their indifference. It was a Tuesday, which lent the platforms a certain midweek melancholy, and as we stepped out of our hansom, I noted that Holmes's mood had darkened to match the weather. His steps were purposeful but unhurried, as though the answers he sought had already assembled themselves somewhere behind his eyes, waiting merely for verification. We passed the newsboys and loitering porters, Holmes ignoring the hasty tips of caps and the foggy stares of idle passengers. Near platform 3, beneath the eaves that offered scant protection from the fine rain, stood the object of our return, a modest iron umbrella stand, unremarkable to all but those who had learned to read the world's anomalies as Holmes did. There, he murmured, as described. 6 umbrellas hung from the frame, their black canopies drawn close like folded wings. From a distance, one might have mistaken them for the same model, twin brothers born of a common reign. But Holmes moved closer and gestured for me to remain still. He examined the first with the care of a jeweller inspecting a flawed gem. "Scuffed along the handle, Watson. From a man who walks with a limp. His right hand compensates." He replaced it and moved on. The second was, to my eye, identical, but Holmes observed, "A broken ferrule, repaired with a strip of copper, common enough among tradesmen but not used on government-issued pieces." The third bore a faint but discernible monogram, RCL, etched in silver. Holmes merely tapped the letters with one long finger and said, "A name too cautious to own its full self." When he reached the fourth, his movement slowed. The handle was polished smooth, its cane shaft thinner than the rest, and when Holmes lifted it, I noted the absence of that slight counterweight that comes with a well-balanced umbrella. He rotated it gently in his hands, then held it upside down. "Aha," he whispered. "Now we trespass into purpose." He pressed lightly along the base of the grip, and with a soft click, barely audible above the sigh of the wind, a small panel slid free. From within the hollow shaft he withdrew a tightly rolled strip of parchment no thicker than a feather quill and scarcely longer than his finger. He did not unroll it immediately, but glanced sideways at me. "Would you care to hazard a guess, Watson?" "A message, no doubt." "More than that," he said. "A voice. A tongue, not spoken, but played." He unfurled the strip and laid it flat across his palm. I saw symbols, bars and lines, some with tiny marks at precise angles, others curved like hooks. It bore a resemblance to musical notation, though lacking clef or signature. There were dots and slashes that meant nothing to me. Holmes studied it for a long moment, then smiled, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of grim recognition. "It is not a message," he said quietly. "It is a score. A musical score. In the loosest sense. These markings correspond to pitch, yes, but also to steps, to position, to time. It is a cipher, and a rather elegant one at that." He paused and added, "The kind used when even silence must leave no trace." He returned the parchment to his pocketbook and moved to the 5th umbrella. This one had the faintest residue of moisture near the ribs, though the rest had dried. When he sniffed the tip, his expression changed. Balkan blend, Turkish base, cut with Syrian leaf. A rare choice among the civilized. And yet here it is. He gently pried the shaft apart and tapped the interior with his knuckle. Ash, fine, grey and fresh, spilled into his hand. "A smoker then," I said. Holmes nodded. "Not merely a smoker, but one in haste. This was used, then abandoned, or, more precisely, it was exchanged." He moved on to the 6th and final umbrella. At first he said nothing, only frowning as he touched it. "This," he said slowly, "is untouched. Untouched. Entirely. It is bone dry. No scent of tobacco, no trace of wear. The edges are sharp, the folds too neat. It has not been opened, not even once. But surely, I began, it might be a spare, left by mistake. Or a decoy, he said, eyes narrowing. An offering to confuse the balance. Holmes stepped back and surveyed all 6 umbrellas once more, as a general might inspect his troops before the lines are drawn. He lingered for another minute in silence before reaching for the 5th umbrella, the one with ash and Balkan scent, and handed it to me. "Carry this," he said, "with care. And the rest? Let them remain." He turned from the stand and added, almost to himself, "The dance has not begun yet, Watson, but the floor is being cleared, and soon the music will start." We returned to Paddington the following afternoon and took up position near the tobacconist's kiosk, a discreet corner from which we could observe the umbrella stand without drawing attention. Holmes stood motionless, his arms crossed within his Inverness cape, his eyes flicking now and again toward the flow of passengers that passed like shadowy figures on a stage. I busied myself with the pretense of reading a newspaper, though my gaze frequently drifted to the stand and to Holmes, whose expression betrayed nothing save that peculiar intensity I'd come to associate with moments of quiet revelation. The hour was just approaching 4:15 when Holmes murmured, "There." She emerged from the stream of travellers like a note of colour in a page of grey. A woman, tall and finely postured, cloaked in green with the hood drawn low, moved with the elegance of one who has rehearsed every step. She made her way toward the umbrella stand not as one uncertain or hesitant, but with the poise of familiarity. She paused. Her gloved hands hovered for a moment above the row of umbrellas. One by one, she touched them, not all but several, lightly, as though testing their weight or structure, her fingers resting a beat, longer on the third than the others. But she did not take one, nor did she speak to anyone. After no more than 20 seconds, she turned and melted once more into the crowd, vanishing beyond the ticket office, without ever approaching a platform. Holmes exhaled softly. "That is not a woman awaiting departure," he said. "That is a woman fulfilling a role." We observed the same scene the following day, and again the next. Always the same hour, always the same green cloak, always the same slant ballet of gloved fingers upon anonymous umbrellas. Holmes made no effort to follow her yet, though his gaze narrowed a fraction more each time. "There," he said on the 3rd afternoon, almost absently. A subtle lift of the hand. "See it?" I followed his gaze. The woman, having completed her examination, now brushed her right hand lightly against the lapel of her coat before turning. A porter at the far end of the concourse, a young man with a narrow moustache, returned the gesture by adjusting his cap. Holmes made a faint noise in his throat. "Signalling," he said, "and not to us." It was clear now that we were watching a ritual, not a routine. Her steps were too careful, her rhythm too regular, for it to be otherwise. Holmes watched her departure in silence, and I thought I saw a flicker of admiration, or was it pity, pass across his expression. On the 5th day, while Holmes was distracted momentarily by a dispute at the luggage desk, it was I who noticed the man in the tweed overcoat. He stood some distance from the umbrella rack, half obscured by a column, reading, or pretending to read, a railway guide. He looked up only once, and that was as the green-cloaked woman approached. There was something in his bearing that struck me as incongruous. His clothes were of quality, yet slightly out of fashion. His boots were well worn, but clean. He watched her closely, not lecherously, nor as one who admired from afar, but with the gaze of one calculating a risk. When she turned away, he did not follow directly. He waited a full minute, then disappeared in the same direction. I relayed my observation to Holmes. "Excellent, Watson," he said. "We are not the only ones watching, but the difference, I fear, is that our fellow observer plays a deeper game than mere curiosity." On the 7th afternoon, Holmes's attention focused not upon what the woman touched, but upon what she did not. As her fingers danced once more across the handles, One umbrella was conspicuously ignored. The fifth, the very one we had previously removed and replaced. "Note that," Holmes said, his voice a thread of thought. She examined each save that one. Her hand hovered but never made contact. Curious, is it not? Almost as if she knew to avoid it. Exactly, as if it bore the scent of disruption, as if her instructions, whatever they may be, contained a precise enumeration of which umbrellas were live and which were not. He paused. "She is not collecting messages, Watson. She is confirming their delivery." That evening, as the fog began to roll in from the west and the lamps cast halos upon the damp stone, Holmes made his decision. "Tomorrow," he said, "we follow her." I looked up from my notes. "To what end?" "To see what lies beyond the curtain," he replied, "and whether our cloaked lady knows she walks beneath it." There was no trace of triumph in his voice, only the weary resolution of a man preparing to step from observation into consequence. The puzzle was no longer content to sit quietly beneath the rain. It was, like all truths eventually, preparing to move. The following morning, as the mist clung low to the city's streets, and even the newsboys seemed reluctant to shout, Holmes and I returned to Paddington under the pretext of a forgotten belonging. He had brought with him a claim tag, spurious of course, bearing a vague date and number. When presented with a quiet authority at the station's inquiry desk, it earned us a nod from the attendant and a distracted wave toward the umbrella stand, now positioned slightly to the left of its former place. Holmes made no display of haste. His eye drifted across the rack once, then again more slowly. His hand settled upon one of the black umbrellas near the rear, unremarkable in form, though I noticed it bore a brass ferrule quite unlike the others. He lifted it, tapped it once against his boot, and muttered something about it being wrongly tallied. We departed without further incident. Back on Baker Street, Holmes set the umbrella upon the table as one might set a fragile relic from antiquity. He examined it not for function, but for purpose, running his fingers along the stitching near the canopy's apex and then along the inner seam of the lining. With his nail, he pried loose a tiny stitch no longer than a grain of barley. The fabric peeled back, revealing a narrow slip of cream paper, folded twice and pressed flat. He handed it to me. "You'll observe," he said, "that the message was not meant to survive the rain. Fortunately for us, it has." I unfolded it slowly. The characters upon it were unfamiliar. There were no words in the traditional sense. Only a series of lines, curves, and symbols, some vertical, others looping. A primitive form of code, perhaps. To the eye of the untrained, Holmes said, mere gibberish. But look closer. Do you see the clef? I squinted. There. Yes, that curl. Is that not a treble clef? Precisely. And below it, a time signature. See the 3/4. I nodded, and Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. The author of this message was not merely literate in music, he said. He, or she, used musical notation not as art, but as language. What you see before you is not a melody, it is a cipher, encoded in the lexicon of musicians. I stared at the page with renewed respect. But how can such symbols convey information beyond pitch or rhythm? Holmes tapped the page lightly. Every note is a letter, every rest a space. The bars are not measures but sentence divisions. It is a clever means of communicating in plain sight, especially among the cultured class, where a line of manuscript is more likely to attract praise than suspicion. He took the paper from my hand and unfurled it fully on the table, pressing the corners flat with the edge of his pipe and a paperweight. "Let us see," he murmured, "whether we might coax this composition into confession." With the patience of a monk and the care of a watchmaker, Holmes reached for a pencil and began notating letters above each note. At first it was no more than a scattering, F, B, Watchum. Then he paused, made a correction, and began again. You recall, Watson, my study of the Gregorian scales during the affair of the Melrose choirmaster. Vaguely, I admitted. There are patterns here, sharp intervals in threes, flattened fifths, common among codes that rely on chromatic movement. It is not random. His pencil paused, then resumed with renewed confidence. Observe here. This descending line, C, B, N, when converted to numerical code, using a reversed index of the English alphabet, we get 24, 25, 26, or rather X, Y, Z if read traditionally, but these do not correspond to the message's theme. However, when transposed against a military cipher grid, he fetched a second notebook and began aligning rows. My own faculties lagged far behind his now whirring mind, yet I recognized the glint in Holmes's eyes, not of mere discovery, but of confrontation. He had glimpsed the mind behind the ink. It is military, he said at last. And more than that, it is not of the present. This cipher, Watson, is drawn from an obsolete codebook, one used during the early campaigns in the Afghan hills. My heart stirred at the memory. You mean the dispatch code used by intelligence riders on the northern frontier? Just so, Holmes said, tapping the final row. Crude but precise, and known only to those who served under the old cloak of empire. He sat back, the page now bearing faint letters above every symbol. A sentence had begun to emerge, one incomplete but chilling. Transfer 3, once confirmed. Stall 5 until signal. Holmes folded the paper slowly, his expression unreadable. We are not deciphering music, Watson, he said. We are eavesdropping on a war still being fought. Only now the weapons are umbrellas, and the battlefield lies beneath our very feet. As Holmes continued annotating the parchment with calm, deliberate motions, I found myself transfixed not only by the unfolding code, but by something deeper, something that tugged, unexpectedly, at the darker recesses of a memory. A figure stirred in my mind, a gaunt man, wrapped in a khaki greatcoat, hunched beside a camel in the rocky wastes beyond Kandahar. His voice had been low, clipped by exhaustion, as he pressed into my palm a thin sheet of paper inscribed with lines that looked like a child's attempt at music. Lieutenant Talbot, I said aloud, more to myself than to Holmes. Holmes glanced up. Talbot, a courier from the old days. He was captured, briefly, sent back by the tribesmen after a ransom was paid, though he never quite returned in spirit. Before he disappeared again entirely, he showed me a cipher like this one. It had to be read, not left to right, but by thirds, diagonally. The code, he said, belonged to an abandoned system, one that relied on the interplay between notes and geography. Holmes's eyes lit, not with surprise, but with recognition. Precisely what I suspected. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. You, Watson, have just provided the final key. The cipher does not unfold musically, but cartographically. Each note's pitch corresponds to elevation, each beat a degree of movement, north, east, south, west. The result is not a melody, but a map. I bent forward as he pointed to a second segment of the message, this one more compressed, with sharp, repetitive rhythms. These are coordinates, Holmes said, but not geographic in the strictest sense. Observe this passage here. B flat, G, E, repeated twice. Transposed against the Admiralty's own cipher book, these letters refer to departmental initials. B for ballistics, G for Gibraltar, E for East Dock Division. And these, he continued, are not merely place names or departments. They are intersections of responsibility, where information is gathered, passed and concealed. The final lines of the parchment bore what at first glance appeared to be arpeggios, ascending triads spaced across the bar like stair steps. Holmes traced them with his nail. These, he said, are transfers, Each cluster marks the passage of knowledge, not papers, but words. Meetings, messages pass between agents whose identities are themselves hidden in the rhythm. He looked up at me, and for the first time that day, there was a shadow beneath his calm. This is not an isolated mechanism, Watson. This is a system. A long silence followed. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice had taken on a tone I seldom heard from him, one of quiet, almost wistful curiosity. To write in such a way, he said, tapping the parchment lightly, requires a composer's discipline and a spy's restraint. This is not the work of a common thief or a reckless traitor. It is the work of someone who understands beauty as a veil for betrayal. He stood and crossed to the window. Outside, Baker Street lay half submerged in a London fog, thick with soot and secrecy. "Consider, Watson," he murmured, "the elegance of it. A message that can be sung but never spoken, passed in daylight, admired by fools, feared only by those who can read silence." He turned back to me. "This hand," he said, holding up the parchment, "belongs to someone who knows precisely how much sound the world can tolerate before it begins to listen." Then, folding the cipher with great care, he placed it in the pocket of his coat and straightened his collar. "I believe it is time," he said, "that we return to Paddington. The hour of exchange draws near, and I would hear the footsteps behind the music." The following day dawned with a slow, colourless drizzle, a curtain of fine mist that blurred the outlines of hansoms and rendered the gas lamps along Baker Street no brighter than dim stars. Yet Holmes, who had scarcely slept, was already hard at work with scalpel and ink, bent over the dissected remains of an umbrella that now lay like a corpse upon our sitting-room table. "It must resemble the original in every respect," he said, more to himself than to me. "The grain of the leather, the pressure of the clasp, even the slight warp in the canopy stitching. Men who traffic in secrets seldom check twice, but when they do, their scrutiny is exacting." He had already transcribed a forged cipher, nearly indistinguishable from the original, but altered in subtle ways that would betray anyone acting upon it. With delicate fingers, he slid the new slip into the hollow shaft of a replica umbrella, sealed it with gum, and twisted the handle shut. "Now," he said, standing and inspecting his work, "let us see who among our unseen musicians strikes the next note." By late afternoon, the rain had grown more insistent, tapping against my collar as I made my solitary way toward Paddington. I carried the false umbrella in my gloved hand and wore a hat, low upon my brow. Holmes had instructed me to move as one agitated by delay, someone arriving with purpose but seeking no attention. I was to approach the stand near platform 3 and deposit the umbrella as though reclaiming a forgotten item, then withdraw without pause or backward glance. I confess, as I moved through the crowded concourse, a strange tension mounted within me, a sense that I was not merely an observer, but a player in a game whose rules I only partly understood. I slipped the umbrella into the rack, ensuring its position mirrored that of the original. No one appeared to notice. A porter coughed. A woman murmured to a child. A whistle shrieked somewhere in the distance. And then I turned and was gone. Some 30 minutes later, I joined Holmes and Lestrade in a waiting area tucked behind a pillar on the opposite side of the concourse. The yardman had arrived at Holmes's request, grumbling but compliant. "You're asking me to nab a man for picking up an umbrella," he had muttered. "Seems a bit theatrical, Holmes." Holmes had merely smiled. "If theatre were all it were, Lestrade, I should let you write the script." And so we waited, the three of us, Holmes calm and unspeaking, I feigning nonchalance with a newspaper I could not read, and Lestrade pulling at the edge of his moustache with growing irritation. Holmes smoked steadily, the thin threads of his pipe's smoke curling upward into the station's darkening rafters. As around us the platform swelled with late travellers, clerks returning from long days, and the occasional solitary figure, neither hurried nor delayed, merely present. At precisely 11:52, Holmes removed the pipe from his lips and said, very softly, "Now." A man emerged from the eastern corridor, his pace unhurried, his face half obscured by the collar of a naval greatcoat turned against the damp. He was tall, though not notably so, with the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but unaccustomed to being watched. His stride took him directly to the umbrella stand. He paused for no more than 2 seconds, selected the umbrella I had placed there, and continued toward the southern platform, where the midnight train to Exeter stood waiting beneath a cloud of patient steam. Holmes stepped out from the pillar. "He's earlier than I expected," he said. "Come, Lestrade." The yardman hesitated. "You're sure?" Holmes's expression did not change. "Quite." We made our way quickly down the platform, keeping just behind the man as he approached the third carriage, where the conductor had momentarily turned his back. Just as he raised one boot to mount the step, Lestrade surged forward. "Hold it there, sir." The man turned, his face half lit by the station lamps, a face neither remarkable nor plain, one that might have commanded a room or vanished into a crowd, depending on the circumstance. He said nothing. "I'm Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard," the yardman announced, puffing out his chest. "And I'd like a word with you about that umbrella." The man's eyes flicked to Holmes, then to me. His stance shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though weighing the effort of escape. "Don't," said Holmes quietly. "There are 4 constables at either end of this platform, and you've just selected an object that does not belong to you. You'll find it quite unplayable." The man lowered his foot and sighed. "Well then," he said, "I suppose you've earned your little triumph." Lestrade stepped in with the cuffs. "You'll come with us." The man complied without struggle, though his eyes never left Holmes. They burned with neither fear nor defiance, but something colder, calculation, tinged with disappointment. Back at the station's inquiry room, Lestrade laid out his questions with the bureaucratic firmness of a man confident that forms would follow facts. "Name, Captain Lionel March. Rank? Retired. Assignment? None that concern you." Holmes stood back, arms folded, saying nothing. When Lestrade had stepped out to consult with the telegraph office, Holmes finally spoke. "You are not Captain March," he said. "I am," the man replied evenly. "You cannot be. Captain March died in the Adriatic 2 years ago. A fire aboard the HMS Cerberus. Identified by his signet and the clasp of his dress coat." The man said nothing. Holmes stepped forward and laid a hand upon the umbrella. "No man who dies in flames carries messages across platforms 2 years later." The silence that followed was not the silence of evasion. It was, I thought, something stranger, the silence of a man who has already outlived the truth and means to live past it once more. The following morning found us once more at Scotland Yard, seated in a spare office whose single gas lamp cast a jaundiced glow upon the battered desk and the bundle of papers now laid out before Holmes. Lestrade stood nearby, arms folded across his chest, visibly wrestling with disbelief as Holmes paged through a series of sealed dossiers with the quiet familiarity of a man reacquainting himself with an unfinished tune. "There," Holmes said at last, tapping one page gently. "Captain Lionel March. Commissioned under the Eastern Naval Office, liaison to the Baltic Cipher Corps, presumed lost at sea in the Cerberus fire off Valona Bay. Date, July 3rd, 3 years past." Lestrade frowned. "And you believe our man is he?" "I do," Holmes replied calmly. "And more than that, I believe his disappearance was neither accidental nor unfortunate. It was designed." Lestrade let out a quiet breath. "But for what purpose?" Holmes closed the file. "To become more valuable dead than living. A vanished officer is a void. Into that void can be poured whatever identity one requires. Ghost, courier, traitor. March chose to become all 3. There was a long silence. Holmes tapped his fingers against the folder, as though marking time. "You must understand," he continued. "March did not return by ship. He returned by cipher. In the quiet that followed, Lestrade's brows furrowed further. You mean the umbrellas? Holmes nodded. Each one a note, each transfer, a movement in an orchestration visible only to those who knew the tune. He re-entered Admiralty circles not through formal reinstatement, but by implication, by becoming the source of invisible authority. He exploited the need of junior clerks to feel part of something greater, something hidden. He offered them glimpses, just enough to believe, never enough to question. Why not speak to them directly? I asked. Because, Holmes said, nothing commands loyalty like fear, and nothing instills fear like the unknown. Holmes crossed to the fire, where a kettle hissed quietly. He worked beneath the surface. A whisper, a gesture, a code slipped into a hollow handle. March became a presence precisely by being an absence. He dealt in fragments, dates, initials, schedules, nothing that would stir an alarm when isolated, but together, a mosaic of dangerous insight. Lestrade shook his head. So the clerks gave him what he needed. Willingly, though unknowingly. In their minds, they were answering to an upper tier of security, a shadow department, and he reinforced the illusion with precision, changing locations, varying the patterns, planting umbrellas that delivered instructions under the guise of accidents. Then the murdered lad, Grigsby. Holmes turned, his face grave. Grigsby made the fatal error of connecting too many dots. He had begun cross-referencing the notes he received. Perhaps only out of curiosity, he noticed patterns, names repeated, times that didn't match the official register. Whether he confronted someone or merely hesitated, he became a liability. And in this business, Watson, liability is often repaid in steel. I felt again the chill I had known too often on campaign, the realization that war does not always wear a uniform. He was likely stabbed by someone under March's instruction, Holmes went on, perhaps even believing they were acting on behalf of the Crown. Such is the danger of ghosts. He paused then, and for a moment his voice softened. Not in sympathy, but in reflection. March's brilliance lay not in what he took, but in what he made others give freely. By inserting himself into a structure that already ran on secrecy and rank, he simply offered a second path, one where every action could be justified as duty and every doubt punished as treason. We sat for a time in silence. Then Lestrade rose and with a grunt returned to the desk. Well, he said, we've enough for the report, I suppose. I'll see to it March is processed for intelligence crimes and unlawful impersonation of a military officer. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And what of the umbrellas? Lestrade chuckled. I'll add them to the evidence list. But Holmes did not smile. Lestrade, he said quietly, umbrella number 6 is missing. The yardman paused, pen in hand. You're sure? Quite. The one Renfield described was not among those at the station last night. And what of it? Holmes looked past us both, toward the smoke-laced glass of the window. One instrument does not make a symphony. I fear, Lestrade, we have captured only the conductor. The score, I suspect, remains in motion. It was the following evening when Mr. Alfred Renfield returned to Baker Street. He arrived with the decorum of a man who had been summoned, though no summons had been sent. There was no unease in his bearing as Mrs. Hudson showed him in, only the reserved politeness of one who carries a concealed purpose behind a familiar smile. Holmes received him with the warmth of an old acquaintance, gesturing toward the fire and offering tea without irony. A miserable week for travel, Holmes said, stirring his cup. The wind conspires with the timetables, it seems, to produce only delay. Renfield accepted his cup without reply. He sipped once, then folded his gloves neatly in his lap. I trust you've heard of the arrest, Holmes continued. Captain March, or rather, the man who wore his name like a second coat. Renfield's gaze remained level. It has reached the department, he said. We are relieved, naturally. Holmes smiled gently. Yes, I imagine you are. From the side table, Holmes produced a long, black object and placed it beside the teacups. It was an umbrella, not the one retrieved by Watson, not one from the Paddington rack. This was the sixth, immaculate, unused, and until now absent. "You'll understand," Holmes said softly, "that 5 umbrellas make a pattern, but it is always the sixth that confounds the eye." Renfield's composure did not falter, but his fingers shifted slightly upon the gloves. "This was never part of March's orchestration," Holmes said. "Its construction is too recent, the wood too fine, and its placement too perfect. It was not a note played by the dead, Mr. Renfield, but by the living." Renfield set down his teacup. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Holmes?" "Accusation is the weapon of men who seek justice," Holmes replied. "I seek only clarity." He rose and walked to the fireplace, letting the silence settle between them. Then, in a tone that seemed almost conversational, he continued, "You arrived at Baker Street claiming to have lost an umbrella, a minor oddity, but your story came not a day after a junior clerk was murdered, stabbed behind Paddington Station. You made no mention of the Admiralty's growing leakages. You offered concern, but no urgency, and you brought me to the stand not to solve a mystery, but to see what I would do when faced with one." Holmes turned slowly, his voice low. "You planted the 6th umbrella, Mr. Renfield." The gentleman gave a short, colourless laugh. "That's absurd." "And yet here it is," Holmes replied, tapping the handle. "Not listed among the others, not seen by the woman in the green cloak, untouched, because it was never part of the exchange. It was there to distract me, to cloud the signal March had set in motion, and once I had taken interest, once I had cast suspicion toward him, you faded into the narrative as a man who had merely lost a personal belonging." Renfield's features were still. Not even the eyes betrayed him. "But March," Holmes said, "was a ghost of his own making. You knew that, and you used it. You allowed him to return, allowed the cipher to revive, knowing that once he drew breath again in the world of secrets, he would need only one nudge to fall. And you, Mr. Holmes," Renfield said quietly, "you gave that nudge." Holmes inclined his head. "As you knew I would." For a moment, neither man spoke. The clock ticked with terrible softness in the corner. "You built a case on his ashes," Holmes said, "then used my reputation to turn them into rope." He walked to the window, where the fog pressed softly against the panes. "You played a double game, Mr. Renfield, serving your office with one hand and dismantling it with the other. A man who manipulates from within cannot be seen to act, but he can make others act in his place." There was no outburst, no confession, only a long, chilling stillness. I sat beside the fire and watched Renfield's hands that once signed orders, initial documents, passed unnoticed through corridors where decisions were made. They now trembled, just perceptibly, the right thumb brushing the knuckle of the left, in a motion repeated perhaps for comfort or guilt, or neither. He said nothing. Holmes did not press him. Instead, he returned to his chair and sat opposite him once more. "You needn't fear the Yard," he said after a pause. "I shall not inform them." Renfield looked up at last. "No, no," Holmes said, his voice cool. "The law has no net for men who wear 2 faces at once. They would arrest one and shake hands with the other. And I have no interest in wasting energy on a machine designed to punish certainty but blind to duplicity." Renfield gave the barest nod. Holmes rose and gestured to the door. "You may go," he said, and so he did. He gathered his gloves, stood with care, and walked from our rooms without haste or hesitation, vanishing into the velvet dark of Baker Street as though he had never truly arrived. I sat for a long while in silence. "He'll do it again," I said at last. "Yes," Holmes replied, gazing into the fire, "but not with umbrellas." Holmes did not rise to watch Renfield's figure vanish into the night. He remained by the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, the other motionless by his side. I, on the other hand, moved instinctively to the window, half expecting the yard to arrive on Holmes's heels. Summoned by conscience, if not by telegram, but no such call was made. Holmes simply stood there, his gaze fixed somewhere between the fire and his own thoughts. "You are letting him go," I said finally. "I am," he replied, without looking up. I could not keep the incredulity from my voice. "And that's the end of it?" Holmes turned then, his expression unreadable. "There are crimes, Watson, that wear no uniforms, bear no weapons, and speak no threats aloud. Such offences do not reside in our courts, not because they are invisible, but because they are inconvenient." I said nothing, and he continued with a faint air of weariness. "To expose Renfield would mean unpicking half a dozen threads already sewn tightly into the Admiralty's sleeves. The scandal would rupture alliances, shatter confidence, and bury a score of lesser men who never even knew the role they played." "You still believe him dangerous?" "I know him to be," Holmes said softly, "but he is dangerous in ways the Yard cannot prosecute. His weapons are access, ambiguity, and bureaucratic silence. And for those, Watson, there is no statute." 2 days later, I accompanied Holmes once more to Scotland Yard. Lestrade met us with the air of a man freshly victorious, his fingers drumming on the closed file before him. "Well," he said, "March is locked up and already mumbling into his porridge. We've wired the Navy office and passed the ciphered evidence to their chaps. Case closed, I'd say." Holmes offered a polite nod. "Congratulations." "Can't say I understand half of what you uncovered," Lestrade went on, "but the higher-ups are pleased. Some sort of hush-hush clearance business, I gather." He slid the file across the table and folded his hands. "All in order now." I glanced at Holmes, expecting him to challenge the narrative, to point out that March had not acted alone, that the threads did not end in Exeter, but curved quietly back into the corridors of Whitehall. But Holmes merely adjusted his gloves and replied, "I'm relieved the matter has found resolution." Lestrade grinned and tapped the file. "Always tidy work, Holmes." But as we stepped outside into the greyness of the street, I could feel the tension within Holmes, like a taut violin string not yet played. "You think it's far from tidy," I said. He didn't answer at first. "It's complete," he said at last, which is not the same thing. Later that afternoon, we arrived again at Paddington Station, not for surveillance or deduction, but for something quieter. Holmes carried with him a parcel wrapped in brown paper, slender and long, and bore an envelope tucked within his breast pocket. Without word or flourish, he led me to a row of lockers near the western stairwell, those rarely used, set aside from the bustle. He opened one, placed the parcel inside, and gently closed the door. Then, from his pocket, he withdrew the envelope, unsealed, unstamped, and slid it beneath the parcel's string. The umbrella within was unmistakable, the 6th, the one that never belonged to March, nor the stand, nor any passenger who might wait beneath London's indifferent rain. I could not keep from asking, "To whom is that meant?" "No one," Holmes said. We left the station in silence, our coats drawn close against the mist. As we turned down Praed Street, the fog softened even the clatter of wheels. Holmes walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Some truths," he said after a time, "are like raincoats hung behind locked doors, kept dry not because they are sacred, but because once exposed to the elements, they dissolve." He paused at the corner, glancing at me with that faint sardonic curve of the mouth I had come to know so well. "You see, Watson, justice, as we know it, is a splendid thing in sunlight, but in storms, it's not always the truth that stays dry." And with that, we turned homeward, leaving behind a locker, a letter, and a lie, folded neatly in the shape of an umbrella. Watson and I had barely cleared the iron steps of Paddington when the first drops of rain began to fall. Holmes, his collar upturned, paused beneath the grey awning of a newspaper kiosk, his gaze following the slow departure of the Exeter train, its plume swallowed by the soot-dark clouds overhead. You let him walk, I said at last. Renfield, after all that, after what we know. Holmes did not look at me. And tell me, Watson, what court shall admit a truth dressed in umbrellas and silence? What gallows would dare condemn a man whose crimes require a lexicon not yet printed? I stood beside him in silence. The game he played was not against a single man, Holmes murmured, but against the architecture of loyalty itself. March was merely the piece sacrificed. A moment passed. Do you ever regret not choosing war over medicine? I asked suddenly. Holmes smiled faintly. No, medicine heals wounds. War invents reasons to inflict them. We crossed the street then, and the umbrella locker behind us remained unclaimed. One final cipher that perhaps was never meant to be read. What do you think was Renfield's gravest miscalculation? Trusting Holmes to remain silent, or trusting the world never to listen? If you've enjoyed this mystery of shadows and strategy, share your thoughts in the comments. And if the game still interests you, subscribe for more tales of deduction and perhaps deception.